Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for Ecojustice's first ever online conversation series. My name is Carolyn, and I work on the communications team at Ecojustice. And together with my colleagues, Venetia and Caroline, I'll be working behind the scenes to help run today's online conversation. So I'm based in Vancouver in my home office in my kitchen right now, and Ecojustice's headquarters are also located in Vancouver. And as such, I'd like to acknowledge that I work and live on the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And as a guest on these lands, I think about what it means to make this acknowledgement. And today, for me, it's a reminder to actively work toward decolonizing my thinking and that sort of dominant societal mindset. So in just a moment, Ecojustice's Executive Director, Devin Page, is going to hop online. But before we get into things, I want to quickly go over some housekeeping items to get everyone comfortable with the online platform we're using. So on the right of your screen, you will see an image of the control panel. And there are three features on the panel that I want to point out: the Grab tab, your audio options, and the question box. So the Grab tab is the orange arrow at the top left of your control panel. And clicking on it will expand or minimize the panel. And with the control panel expanded, you'll see your two audio options, computer audio and phone call. To switch between the two, click on the circle beside your preferred audio option. If you want to use your phone, this is where you can find instructions for calling in. And if you're joining by computer audio, we recommend that you use a headset for best quality. And I'll just chat quickly about the question box. So you can use this to submit comments and questions at any point during today's conversation. We have set aside time at the end for a question and answer period, but I encourage you to send in your questions as they arise. And just so you know, for transparency, whatever you submit via the chat box can only be seen by me and my communications colleagues. So I'll be forwarding your messages, your questions along to Devin, and he'll be posing them to Elaine. Also, on my end, I can send messages to all of you, but I don't have the capacity to send private messages. So go ahead and send a question or comment now if you want to just test that out. And otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Devin.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Ecojustice's Better Than Normal Conversation series. As Carolyn said, I'm Devin Page. I'm the host for today's conversation and Executive Director of Ecojustice. I'm joining you from my outfitted home office. We've all been working remotely since March 12th, and I'm happy to say we're all healthy and working hard. I see that quite a few folks have joined us today. I'm pretty excited about that. And I'm curious to know who we've got online and where you people are joining us from. So we want to give you a chance to engage with the chat function and just plunk in there where you are. As you all know, most of you know, Ecojustice operates in every province and territory in the country. We've had cases on coast to coast to coast, and we have supporters in all provinces and territories. So we're curious to see where you are. And it looks like we're seeing folks from all over the place. There's Toronto, there's Burnaby, places right across the country. So that gives you a chance to have, and we've got some Alberta folk as well. Nice to have you on board. So I'm going to dive into a little bit about us and then introduce Elaine MacDonald, who's going to be the main event today. For those of you that are new to Ecojustice, we go to court and we use the power of law to defend nature, combat climate change, and fight for a healthy environment. Our strategic, innovative, public interest lawsuits lead to legal precedents that deliver lasting protection to Canada's most urgent environmental problems. We're Canada's largest environmental law charity, and we operate in offices in Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Ottawa, and Halifax. In fact, we just celebrated the second anniversary of our Halifax office, and one that's interestingly these days becoming one of our busiest. Now, this is the first time in our history we're doing series like this, and you probably know why. These are extraordinary times. We're all adapting. I'm pleased to say that while some of the court work has slowed down because courts have closed, almost all of Ecojustice's litigation is on track. And we wanted to take this opportunity to reach out to supporters and share an inside look at how we're continuing to work to make sure Canada is better than normal, and where we're going to be when we're on the other side of the COVID pandemic. So today we're going to be in conversation with Dr. Elaine MacDonald. Dr. Elaine MacDonald, PhD, not in law, interestingly enough. And Elaine's someone that I quite often comment is a better lawyer than most of us, but whose background is in chemical engineering. Elaine leads the Healthy Communities team, where she's leading the charge on challenging all levels of government to ensure that every Canadian's right to a healthy environment, especially those most vulnerable, is protected. During Elaine's talk, we encourage you to use the chat box. At the end, I'll facilitate a question and answer period with Elaine, so you can give me your questions and I'll be feeding them to Elaine to get the answers to what matters most to you. So Elaine, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Devin. That was a great intro and I really appreciate that. So I'm coming to you from Toronto, where we're seeing some signs of spring finally. It's been rather cold here for anyone who else is in Toronto. And Toronto is located on the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Pinton First Nation, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I grew up on the shores of the Credit River, so that's near and dear to me. The territory was subject of the dish with one spoon, one belt covenant and agreement with the Iroquois Confederacy, Ojibwe, and allied nations. Taking the time to do a land recognition is really important to me as well. It's, you know, I've lived most of my life in Southern Ontario. It's a beautiful land and I want to respect it, especially for our First People. The first slide I have to talk to you about is some of the program. I guess I'm moving to the next slide. Is really, I'm going to just give you the highlights of our main program areas we work on within Healthy Communities. The first one is focused on toxics and pollution, and what we're really trying to do with this area of program, the one that's in blue there on your slide, is strengthen the regulation of pollution that is threatening human health and the environment, negatively impacted air, water, and soil quality. It is also the area in which we work on assessments and regulation of toxic substances, including pesticides that are impairing our environment, our wildlife, or harming the health of Canadians. The second area is really about helping vulnerable communities, and this area is really dear to me. I feel like this is such important work, particularly communities that are inequitably burdened by pollution. We are helping communities across the country affected by industrial operations, such as mining operations, refineries, oil sands operations, pulp mills, abandoned landfills. The work in this area could be simply helping them communicate with their local authorities, their regulators, helping through environmental assessments, or it could be going to court. It spans the spectrum, but it's really important work, and I'm glad we're able to reach out and help these communities. Some of these communities are First Nations, some are racialized communities like African Nova Scotian communities, but it's key to our work. The last area, which Devin has already really spoken to, is litigating in law reform to formally recognize that people in Canada have the right to a healthy, ecologically balanced environment, a safe, clean, healthy, sustainable environment. Recognizing this right is long overdue in Canada. According to the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Dr. David Boyd, who happens to be a friend of Ecojustice, former lawyer at Ecojustice, former ED at Ecojustice years ago, the right to a safe, clean, healthy, sustainable environment is recognized in law by at least 156 countries of the 193 members of the United Nations, yet Canada is not among those countries. So it's about time they were, which is one of the areas we are working hard towards. We also want to defend existing environmental rights where they do exist, for example, at the provincial level, and I will talk a little bit about that later in my presentation. So the next slide. Thank you. This is the team. I don't do this work alone naturally. In fact, the team does most of the work, and I'm honored to work with them. They are some of the most committed and best and brightest environmental lawyers in Canada. I feel honored and continuously memorized by their skills and their knowledge. They work tirelessly on cases from across the country, and as you can see, they're located across the country. And as Devin mentioned, we do work from coast to coast to coast. In fact, just nearly a couple weeks ago, we did some work in Nunavut. So we are really working across the country. Moving to the next slide. Thanks. I thought I would touch a little bit on pesticides because it's spring. We're starting to see, well, spring more so in some places of the country than others, but we know the flowers are blooming, the trees are in bloom. We were seeing pollinators. In fact, this picture on this slide I took just 2 weeks ago when I was walking my dog. So it reminds us the importance of pollinators, and I want to talk about some of our work we've done on pesticides and the impacts of pollinators. I'm going to go back a little bit though, because pesticides it's been a really kind of one of our longest regulatory areas that we worked in. Going back to the early days to support governments such as the town of Hudson, Quebec and the city of Toronto, when pesticide spraying companies sued them for banning cosmetic use of pesticides as a public health protection measure. The Hudson case went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and we were there acting to defend, intervening to help the town of Hudson defend their pesticide bylaw. Now we have province-wide cosmetic pesticide use bans across the country, although not in every province, so there's still work to be done there. But since those early days, we've just never really stopped working on pesticides, whether before the courts or in seeking reforms to the law. The vast majority of pesticides are used in agriculture. The federal government, through Health Canada, determines which pesticides may be registered for use in Canada and how they may be used to prevent unacceptable risks to the environment and human health. We've been to court several times on behalf of our clients when we believe the laws with respect to the approval and regulation of pesticides in Canada have not been upheld. We challenge the registration of neonic pesticides that harm pollinators like native bees, which are responsible for pollinating 1/3 of the world's crops and 90% of our wild plants. But these are David and Goliath lawsuits that put us up against the biggest chemical manufacturing companies in the world. And although we don't always convince the courts and win these cases, we found that just by taking them on and highlighting the failings of the pesticide regulators, we see progress. So while we have lost some battles in the courts, we are winning a law and policy war on pesticides, but it's not over yet. During one of our neonic lawsuits, the government regulators started to collect the science that they previously ignored or failed to consider, and moved from a recalcitrant position that neonics, short for neonicotinoids, neonics did not present a risk to pollinators, to proposing restrictions and eventually even proposing full phase-outs in response to water monitoring data showing that they were present across Canada in regions where these pesticides were being used. But there's enormous pushback from the pesticide chemical manufacturing industry to delay or even reverse these proposed phase-outs. So Ecojustice and our partners, which you see some of them here on the slide, have and must continue to keep the pressure on to hold the governments to full and fast phase-outs of neonics. In addition, the act that regulates pesticides, is called the Pest Control Products Act, is up for review this year. And there is pressure from pesticide manufacturers to amend the act in a manner that would allow greater use of pesticides by allowing for economic considerations in the registration decisions. We can't and won't let this happen. Our efforts will focus on ensuring that the act's purpose remains on protecting human health and the environment. And should there be an opportunity for a bill to strengthen the act, we will be there advocating for a list of recommendations that we have already put together. Next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that has just come up recently during the pandemic. Unfortunately, some governments have taken advantage of the situation. I'm going to touch on those a little bit today. On April 1st, we have on the slide Jason Kennedy and Doug Ford, so you can probably figure out which governments I'm going to speak about. But on April 1st, Ontario issued a regulation exempting environmentally significant proposals for policies, acts, regulations, even instruments such as permits from public consultation and appeal rights under Ontario's Environmental Bill of Rights. This goes back to defending Environmental Bill of Rights, which I mentioned earlier as an area we continue to work on. This blanket exemption is not limited to proposals that are in response to the pandemic at all. It's completely unnecessary because the Environmental Bill of Rights of Ontario already allows for emergency exemptions on a case-by-case basis. So with our clients, the Canadian Association of Physicians of the Environment and former Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, Gord Miller, you see his little picture down there, we are filing an application to demand that the exemption regulation be revoked and the government use their existing powers to exempt proposals related to pandemic response from the requirements of the BBR on a case-by-case basis, as the law intended. And this is not the first time we've had to go to bat to protect Ontarians' rights under the Environmental Bill of Rights. Last October, we won a lawsuit against Ontario when a two-judge majority of the courts found that Ontario failed to meet its legal obligations when it chose not to consult under the Environmental Bill of Rights before gutting Ontario's greenhouse gas cap and trade program. Ontario is not the only jurisdiction in Canada where we have seen rollbacks during the pandemic. Alberta has also used the COVID emergency to suspend environmental modeling and monitoring and reporting rules under several acts, including suspending 3 oil sands mining operations from water quality and wildlife monitoring, and studies on pollution impacts on neighboring communities. Meanwhile, activities like construction have not been suspended in Alberta. These suspensions are particularly short-sighted given studies have found, and I think it was a study that came out of Harvard University, that found that air pollution can worsen the health impacts of the COVID pandemic. Our lawyers are studying the swath of suspensions in Alberta and are struck by the lack of any COVID-related justification. In their view, these are not about COVID response, but opportunistic exemptions handed out to the failing fossil fuel industry. Moving on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about some work that's been going on for a while. This is work that I am heavily involved in, and that is with respect to the reform of one of Canada's cornerstone environmental laws called the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act is supposed to keep us safe by regulating the release of pollution and the use of toxic chemicals in consumer products. It's a primary source of consumer products have become a primary source of Canadians' daily exposure to toxics. But it's been 20 years since this law was last updated, and it's showing its age. 20 years ago, we were worried about Y2K, if you were around, which turned out not to be such a big issue, unlike coronavirus, which has. Even as Canadians became increasingly exposed to toxic chemicals in our everyday lives, the law has remained stagnant. But I want to note, chemicals are largely petrochemicals derived from fossil fuels. So chemicals management is not an issue that is divorced from climate change. I've seen studies that estimate that chemical and petrochemical industry generates 18% of direct industrial CO2 emissions. And as fuel demand decreases, we expect to see even greater pressure to use fossil fuel reserves to produce petrochemicals. Anyways, we participated in an extensive parliamentary review of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act by the House of Commons Standing Committee. That review produced 87 recommendations to strengthen the Act, many based on ours and our partners' submissions to the committee. These recommendations really lay out a roadmap for modernizing the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. After that report was published, this was in the past Parliament, it was Minister McKenna, who was Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, committed to updating the Canadian Environmental Protection Act in the next Parliament, which is now this Parliament. And that commitment was then handed down through the mandate letters to Minister Wilkinson, who's the new Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, and Minister Hadjiou, who's the Minister of Health. Both have responsibilities under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And the last we heard, that although timelines for a bill to amend SEPA have been pushed back while the government manages the COVID pandemic, which is completely understandable, Minister Wilkinson still intends to follow through with his government's commitment to modernize SEPA during this Parliament by introducing a bill later this year. Our recommendations to government on SEPA modernization are based on years of working under the present-day SEPA. SEPA is short for Canadian Environmental Protection Act, so I apologize if I slip into saying SEPA once in a while. But anyways, it's based on present-day Canadian Environmental Protection Act and its sister program component referred to as the Chemicals Management Plan that began in 2006. The Chemical Management Plan, which is now in its final stages, is a government initiative aimed at reducing the risks posed by chemicals to Canadians and their environment. A large component of the plan is assessing 4,300 prioritized chemicals out of a list of 23,000 chemicals used in Canada that had never been assessed for the risk they may pose to human health or the environment, but were already in use in Canada. If an assessment determines there is a risk of a harmful effect on the environment or human health, the substance is considered to be toxic as defined under SEPA. These assessments consider not only the inherent toxicity of the substance, but also the likelihood that a person, organism, or environment may be exposed to it. It's a bit like an equation. If you think about it, it's hazard times exposure equals risk, and that's how it works under SEPA. This is important because this risk-based approach that SEPA takes means that substances that are highly hazardous may not be determined to be toxic if there's no evidence or likelihood of exposure found. But one of the challenges we face, and the government faces, is that some of these assessments are conducted with little data on the substances used and few studies on the environmental health effects. However, if a substance is ultimately found to be SEPA and then defined as toxic under SEPA, SEPA requires measurements to mitigate the risks, such as regulations. After over a decade of watching this program and participating in this program, actually more like 14 years, we have come to see how it has fallen short. And one of those areas is with respect to the risk-based approach. Some chemicals are so highly hazardous, we'll call them substances of very high concern, that we believe they should be banned regardless of their use in Canada, unless the industry using them can prove that they can be controlled and used safely. If they can't, then the substance must be replaced with a safer alternative. We call this a reverse onus approach, and it is being used in Europe and leading to more bans and restrictions in Canada under our present approach. Substances that could fall into this category could be known human carcinogens, substances that are mutagenic, affecting DNA, substances that are toxic to reproduction, or substances that are chemicals that are so persistent that they never break down, so they bioaccumulate and persist in our environment. But this leads to another area where SEPA fails, and that is SEPA doesn't encourage or require the substitution of toxic substances with a safer alternative, what we call informed substitution. A chemicals management approach based on informed substitution ensures that when a harmful chemical is restricted or banned, it is replaced with a safer alternative rather than another equally or potentially more harmful chemical. When that happens, we call it regrettable substitution because we regret it. And time again, we've seen this play out, leaving Canada stuck on a toxic treadmill to nowhere. And there are so many examples I can point to. I actually had a lot of examples in my discussion and I had to cut them back because it was just going on too long. But I will highlight a few. One is chemical flame retardants. So they're added to many items in our everyday lives, textiles, furnishings, electronics. But they don't stay in those materials. They break down and enter the dust in our homes, and then they enter our bodies. And as one class of chemical flame retardant chemicals are found to be negatively affecting our health and are restricted, another class replaces them with similar health impacts. For example, we've seen PCBs, and then we've seen polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, and then we've seen polybrominated diphenyl ethers, PBDEs, and now that those are being phased out or banned, we're now seeing organophosphate flame retardants. And it's not just humans that are being impacted by these chemicals, animals too. We find them in we find them in whales, we find them in many, many animal species as well. And one of the other points I should make is studies have found that these are largely unnecessary chemicals on top of that, and even firefighters have called for them to be removed because they create such toxic smoke when they do burn. They only slow down ignition a little bit, and then they don't really act. They don't really solve the issue of protecting against fires. Another class of chemical I'm going to talk about briefly is what's called fluorinated chemicals or forever chemicals. You may have heard these. There's a movie that came out a couple of months ago called Dark Waters about a lawsuit in the US where these chemicals had contaminated a town where these chemicals were being manufactured. It's an enormous class of chemicals, 4,700 or something like that, fluorinated chemicals are being used. Two famous ones you may have heard of is PFOA, which is Teflon, and PFOS, which is Scotchgard. But there's thousands of them, and Canada has only acted to ban some of the ban those two, and plus eliminated some long chain ones. And those have been replaced by other PFAS because there are so many of them. So it really hasn't solved the problem. They're also linked to harmful effects such as cancer and liver damage and reproductive harm. So this really highlights the need for us to look at chemicals in terms of class and function, not just one chemical at a time. We need to be thinking about the whole class of PFAS when we're assessing those, so that we don't just see one PFAS, one perfluorinated or forever chemical replacing another when we finally act on it. And some jurisdictions are starting to limit these in consumer products. We've seen action in the US and Washington and California, particularly in removing them from things like food contact material, like pizza boxes and like your takeout containers, which actually do often have these chemicals in them, surprisingly. And I want to talk a little bit about a personal story I had in this. I was invited to a meeting by Health Canada up in Ottawa. This was quite a few years ago. And it was going to, this meeting was going to be about a group of chemicals called phthalates. And these are used in cosmetics, they're used in plastics. I don't get into the detail of phthalates, but I just want to talk about the mentality. I arrived a little late for the meeting because I'd taken the train and the train was late. So I walked into the meeting and it's a group, it's multi-stakeholder session. So you've got industry representatives in the room. I sat down at the first chair that I saw. And I looked around and nobody knew who I was because I was fairly new to this area at the time. And I looked at our table and it was all industry lobbyists and representatives. And as Health Canada was doing their presentation and talking about the phthalates they were going to be assessing, was a group of 14 phthalates they were planning on looking at. One of the representatives from the industry association, I think it was somebody from the cosmetic industry, said, "Oh, we'll just use other ones. We'll just substitute those," joking to his other buddies at the table. And this is exactly what happens. Like it's exactly what I've been portraying here, and that is the mentality. The regulators just can't keep up, which is why we need to shift the approach to managing chemicals. The last thing I want to talk about briefly, and I think I'm running a little long with respect to the Canadian Environment Protection Act, is we want to see a legal recognition of a right to healthy environment and ecologically balanced environment, and in a modernized SEPA. We think incorporating human rights considerations in the decision-making under SEPA ensures a conscious effort is made to avoid adverse human rights impacts in decision-making under SEPA. It guards against discrimination and discourages regression in environmental standards that protect human health. It will also provide protection for vulnerable populations who are at risk, but who are at greater risk, but not considered under SEPA consistently, like workers in industries where there's chemical exposures, for example, or people who live in polluted hotspots. Also, those who are more susceptible, such as asthmatics or women of childbearing age, more susceptible to the impacts of pollution and toxic chemicals. So the result is really that this approach that SEPA has been taking has not resulted in very many very hazardous substances being found to be SEPA toxic. So therefore, they're not being regulated. Moving to the next slide. This is, I think, my last just closing slide. It is clear that normal was neither healthy or sustainable. COVID is a fast-moving pandemic that quickly highlighted many vulnerabilities in our society. It's tragic watching what's happening in long-term care homes and people who are working on the front lines and poorly paid precarious employment. And what it dawned on me as I'm living through this pandemic is that although slower moving, the environmental risks of pollution and toxic chemicals are also not equitably shared in our society. So I really want a post-pandemic or a post-COVID Canada that ensures our most vulnerable are protected and every Canadian has a right to a healthy, balanced, ecologically balanced and sustainable environment. And if you would like to help us hold Minister Wilkinson to that vision and the introduction of a bill to modernize SEPA and recognize every Canadian's right to a healthy, ecologically balanced environment, we have an action alert on our website that you can access and to send him a letter. The other thing that's come out is the COVID crisis has really shown us that some governments, like those of Ontario and Alberta, are quick to use it as an opportunity to weaken environmental oversight and protection and give polluters a free pass. We want to call them out when they do that. And we will continue to call them out when they do that. And as governments move to repair the economy and stimulus spending really represents a massive opportunity to pivot Canada towards a place that is better than normal. Ecojustice and the Healthy Communities team has and will continue to demand green, just stimulus that addresses climate change and pollution by moving us further away from toxic chemicals and fossil fuels and towards a just, equitable, green society. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, thanks, Elaine. And now we're going to put you on the hot seat and have you read questions. And we have received a few questions. Keep them coming in, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. I think we might have too many now, but let's just get as many as we can. The other thing I often say to folks, if you have questions about our work, get in touch with us. We take those kind of questions all the time. So if we run out of time today to put Elaine on the hot seat to answer the questions, we'll find a way to get those answers to you. Okay, Elaine, first question. Does COVID-19 slow down your chances of success for reform of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act?
It has slowed it down. I've got to be straight with you. We were hoping for a bill this spring, and then we were hoping for one in the fall. Then the latest pre-hearing is probably the end of the year. So there has been delay. It's not unsurprising that there's delay. One of our major concerns is that we are dealing with a minority government. So we're not guaranteed to have 4 years of this government to get a bill passed through. But I'm working closely. We have a director of legislative affairs now, Tony Moss at Ecojustice, and he's an expert on these issues. And I'm working closely with him to try and ensure that we get that bill and get it moving through as quickly as possible when we do get it.
Next question, which is related. What can our supporters do to help increase the likelihood that CEPA reform is possible?
Well, I mentioned the action alert already. But the other thing you can do is just talk to your MP. Let them know that this is a priority for you. MPs are extremely busy right now, and it's understandable. They're dealing with so many issues in their constituents. COVID's had such an impact on communities. But my understanding is I'm hearing they still want to hear about the other issues. They want to hear about the issues that are important to Canadians. So I would ask people to reach out to your MP and let them know that you want to see this government honor their commitment to modernizing CEPA and recognizing a right to healthy environment.
Nice. And Elaine, next question, one that I predicted. What is the legal status at this time of the use of neonics in agriculture? Is it banned yet?
Not fully. There's a proposed full phase out. So that is supposed to be finalized in the fall. It's been delayed a little bit. So we are always concerned when we're still sitting in a situation where it's only proposed and we don't have a final decision. So that, I did mention on my presentation that we were going to stay on top of that file to ensure that that proposed phase out is finalized. We have heard that they're looking at the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, which is the agency of Health Canada that oversees the registration and regulation of pesticides, is now studying additional monitoring data that's been collected with respect to neonics. So that's the status right now. But we're hoping that they do follow through with that proposal and finalize the full phase out.
Okay, Elaine, here's another one for you. We're going to test the full scope of your knowledge. Is any work being done on banning rodenticides that kill raptors and other animals who ingest poisoned rodents?
I'm not sure. I have seen some recent decisions with respect to, was it strychnine? I'm trying to remember if that's one of those substances, which are used kind of in baiting wolves and so on. But I would have to go back and look, I would have to go and look at the Pest Management Regulatory Registry to see if anything's happening right now on those. And I would be happy if somebody really wanted to reach out to me. I could help them figure out how to do that or show them where to do that if they wanted to find out. They do have a registry which basically shows any pesticides that are under reevaluation, for example, that are being revisited, or you can find that out through their registry.
The next one, maybe I'll take it, Elaine, and if you want to supplement it, you jump in. But the question is, can Ecojustice use the courts and litigation to fight the rise of greenhouse gas emissions? And while we're talking today about the healthy communities priorities, Ecojustice divides its work among 3 priorities: healthy communities, nature, and climate change. And as you might imagine, climate change is a growing program area for us. We have active litigation across the country related to doing exactly that. So to give you an example, yesterday, our Eastern office introduced a lawsuit to fight the prospective approval of exemption from environmental assessment of offshore drilling off Newfoundland. So there was a proposal to massively increase the amount of offshore oil drilling, and unfortunately for us, more or less a green stamp of that process through what we're hoping would be a more rigorous environmental assessment process. So our lawyers out of the Halifax office launched litigation yesterday. But similarly, we've been engaged and retained on every tar sands mining operation, and the tar sands are the single largest point source of greenhouse gas pollution. We are engaged on a legal case related to drilling in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and so far we've shut that down. And those are probably the marquee examples, but I think in almost every jurisdiction we have an active case related to that. And of course, the one that has taken up a ton of our time is fighting the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the pipeline that would go from the tar sands in Alberta to Canada's west coast in Burnaby. And you know, we're as frustrated as you are to see Canada investing now apparently over $12 million in fossil fuel energy infrastructure for what's been described as a stranded asset in the tar sands. So the answer is yes, we've been quite effective to date and we're quite active. Elaine, is there anything else that you would want to say in that area?
No, there's the only thing is the Ontario Targets case, I guess, but it's also very focused on Ontario's weak greenhouse gas targets. That's the case we've taken on behalf of youth in Ontario.
Here's another one for you, Elaine. You guys jumped really quickly on the issue of the rollback of rights in Ontario. Are there any other provinces that you know of that are rolling back environmental laws in the face of COVID?
So far, we've only seen Alberta and Ontario, but we are watching for any other potential rollbacks. Now it's getting pretty late in the game. I think we would have seen them earlier. So hopefully that's the only two provinces that have moved forward with rollbacks, but it is something we are watching for.
Okay, I think we're going to take two more questions related to your area of expertise, partly because I can't keep up. So I'm reading down here, and here's one I think that's particularly relevant at these times, Elaine. I'm not sure if it falls within your expertise, but let's give it a try. Have there been any links between hazardous chemicals contributing to underlying health conditions that increase the risk of illness from COVID-19?
The only thing I can think of really, well, air pollution. There's been studies that show COVID can attach to particulate matter in the air, that there's an increased risk if you're in a dirty air shed or if you're exposed to more air pollution. So that's the one piece I would say that I mentioned. But I say there are a lot of chemicals that impact people's immune systems. And, you know, if you don't have a strong immune system, it's harder to fight off a virus. So I think there is definitely a link between COVID and chemical exposures that impact things like immune systems.
Elaine, I'll be curious to see if you know about this, and it covers healthy communities, but it also covers our climate program. And it's related to the cleanup of the abandoned and orphaned wells. So as many folks may know, Ecojustice has either led litigation or led law and policy reform to try to get cleanup of abandoned wells in Western Canada. And what one of our supporters wants to know is what is in the wells that needs cleaning. That's the first question that maybe you know, and why isn't it the job of the oil and gas companies to pay for this? And maybe I'll take the second half, you take the first one.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the big issues is it not methane emissions that are of concern with these abandoned wells, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. So cleaning those up and making sure that they're cut off, it's going to reduce hopefully the emissions of a very potent greenhouse gas. I imagine there's just these are often on private land, they're on people's farms, and I'm sure the homeowners want their land cleaned up. So it's part about getting access to that land again for crops or whatever it might be used for in addition.
Well, and I'll take the second part. So the question is, isn't this the job of the oil and gas companies to pay for this? And you know, the answer is, of course it is. Under the original agreement, when drilling permits were granted, they came with a condition that companies would either retain or put into accounts the money that would pay for cleanup after the fact. It wasn't enforced, and particularly in Alberta, it wasn't enforced. Ecojustice led a series, I guess you would call it, exposés of that unfunded liability towards getting particularly again, the Alberta government taking control of that. including having a successful intervention in the Supreme Court to ensure that these oil companies couldn't declare bankruptcy and walk away from them. But the fact is that they did, and as most folks know, the federal government has since allocated as one of the payouts or the stimulus measures in the face of COVID, over $1 billion of cleanup funds. So the taxpayers now are cleaning up the abandoned oil wells the industry left behind. All I can say is that both, particularly in Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan, Ecojustice will be continuing to push for the oil companies to bear the responsibility for cleanup. And it's clear that we still have a lot of work to do in that area. And we're just trying to manage these questions here. Elaine, do we do any work regarding clean water in First Nations communities?
We're not right now. It's actually an area we would really like to be able to work in and help communities that don't have access to safe water. We've reached out to a lot of First Nations offering our services, but we haven't actually found any takers yet, to be honest with you. So if you do have any First Nations that are looking for assistance, that's something we'd be very interested in helping out with. We do help First Nations that are where their communities are being impacted by things like mining activities. We have an ongoing case right now in Quebec helping the Algonquin and Barrier Lake who are being threatened by exploratory mining activity that also will could threaten their sources of drinking water. So in that extent we are, but the access to safe, clean water issue that is so prevalent where we have boil water advisories across the country is not something that we have managed to represent anyone on yet, but we would be very keen to do so.
I'm going to use the next question to make a plug for people participating in an upcoming webinar related to our climate priority. But the question, comment and question, thanks so much for doing this and for all the great information. Wondering where Canada is at with moving away from using fossil fuels. Does Canada at all have a plan to move over to green energy? I'll start, Elaine, if you want to jump in, you can.
You go for it.
Yeah. You know, the thing is we're not doing enough. Where the priority currently is to get Canada to meet the target it's currently set. So as most people know, off we went to the Paris meeting and we signed the accord and we were the first country to commit to the Paris targets. Canada has, over the last 15 years, missed every target that it's ever set. So what Ecojustice is investing heavily in terms of law reform, particularly in Ottawa, is getting the federal government to commit to what we call climate accountability legislation. And that is legislation that would require the government to articulate clear targets and not just do it 20 and 30 years from now, but articulate clear targets in a measured fashion and identify the steps that they're taking to meet those targets and show us the math so that they can demonstrate that they're actually making progress to that and provide the tools to hold them accountable if they fail to do that. It's kind of the key law reform piece that's been missing throughout the decades of promises. So we're right in the middle of that. And if you come to the upcoming climate change webinar, you'll hear Alan Andrews, the head of the climate program, talk about that conversation that's happening right now with the federal government almost on a day-to-day basis. Okay, this, Elaine, I'm going to give you the last closer kind of questions.
Okay.
If you were to say one thing, tell our supporters one thing they should be saying to our elected officials, what would it be? That's a tough one.
I would say, yeah, it is tough, but I would have to say it's recognition of a right to healthy and sustainable environment in law. It's just so long overdue for Canada to do this. And I think it really does shift and reframe the way we address environmental impacts in Canada by centering around a rights basis. So I would say that would be the thing that you should be calling for if you're going to call for, and it's a game changer. It really will shift so many different aspects of the work we're doing.
Elaine, you know, you mentioned it, but aren't we, in terms of industrialized nations, we're one of the few in the world that don't have that.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
North Korea, among others, for not having.
Yeah, no, it's a sad short list of countries that haven't done this, and we are among that. I think in my presentation I said, is it 156 of 193 UN United Nations member states or countries have recognized it and Canada hasn't. So this is a black eye on Canada that we haven't recognized a right to a healthy environment legally in law, and I think it's long overdue. I'm really hoping that this government will do it.
Okay, Elaine, great job. That's your job's done today. So I'm going to
Thank
turn it
you.
over, and I want to thank all of you for joining
Thanks,
us today.
everyone.
Yep. We hope you feel a sense of comfort in knowing that even during uncertain times, the Ecojustice team are as committed as ever, working as hard as we have in using the power of law to fight for your environmental rights. And as I said, make sure you join us for upcoming conversations. Our Better Than Normal conversations will be featuring our nature program, and we'll be featuring our climate program shortly. Now, thank you, everyone. It's really great to have your support and know that you're standing with us. Look, if you're a supporter of ours, you know that we're one of the only charities in Canada that does public interest environmental litigation aimed at holding government and polluters to account. We have always relied on the generosity of donors, people like you, to give us the support to enable us to deliver on our mission. You heard today, there's a lot of work being done, but there's so much more to be done. We know that long-running efforts to protect the environment, efforts that have gained critical momentum, particularly the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, we think it probably is hanging in the balance. It's gained so much momentum in the last 12 months. They have to continue. We can't stop now. This is how we ensure a safer, healthier future on the other side of the pandemic. So what we want to say is, if it's within your ability to do so at this time, please consider making a gift to Ecojustice today. We've added a link in our chat, or you can visit us at www.ecojustice.ca to support our work. Thanks to you, we're going to keep doing what we've always done. We're using the power of law to defend nature, combat climate change, and fight for a healthy environment for all of us. And I see that Carolyn has put out the link for upcoming conversations. And just some housekeeping before I conclude. If you missed part of today's talk, or you would like to share this conversation with a friend, you'll be emailed with a video link in the next couple of days. You'll also be able to find a recorded version on our website later this week. Next conversation, May 28th, Margot Venton, who leads our nature team. And that is an area that is doing some of our most exciting work to save some of Canada's most at-risk species. It's just absolutely important work at this time. If you haven't already, we encourage you to register to learn more about the unique role Ecojustice continues to play in ensuring that Canada's natural spaces and wildlife are protected. Lastly, thank you again for taking time out of your day to join us. Have a great evening. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you so much.